And we're back. This time and today we're talking about the Jester for the Darkest Dungeon. Um, and we're reviewing him. Yes, we're doing a Jester review for the Darkest Dungeon. And we'll be talking about his stats, his skills, his camp skills, resistances, trinkets, team comps. And I did something different with the crit buff this time. I put it in the stats spreadsheet so we can not forget about it by accident. This is the evolution of a YouTuber. You're watching me evolve. But yeah, let's switch over to that. Let's switch over to the stat sheet and the crit bonus at the same time. All right, so here's the spreadsheet, and we have the crit buff down here, so I won't forget about it. And we've got the Jester down here extracted. His numbers have been extracted from here, so I just copy and pasted those numbers down here, and we've got the averages of the rest of the cast that we can compare the Jester to. So let's go through. First let's delete this because we're not talking about the leper anymore. Second of all, let's go through the stats of the Jester individually and see what's up. So we've got HP over here at very below average. He's actually one of the lower HP characters in the game, actually tied for second to lowest with the Occultist, but being overall more bulkier than the Occultist because you do have the highest dodge in the game at 35. That is the only dodge at 35 in the game, and this makes a Jester like pretty like survivable. Mainly because, well, actually, it doesn't make the Jester mainly really survivable. In that he's bulky. It's really just that he's a third and fourth rank character. He's really okay. He's really just a third rank character, so he's not getting hit enough for this poor durability spread to matter. I'm not a fan of high dodge and low HP, just because sometimes you can't predict when the dodging will happen. You ideally want your dodging to be spread out through like you want like the enemy to hit you and then maybe dodge the next one. And then you want the enemy to hit you again. Like you want to alternate maybe. You don't want to just take a few hits in a row and then dodge for the rest of the fight. That's not like ideal. Um so and still 35 is just not consistent enough for you to be able to guarantee dodging a lot of the time. So this is not a good stat spread if he was a frontline character, but he's not. So I'm okay with the spread. The speed, he is the second fastest character in the game, tied with like 4 other people. That's pretty good. I like fast characters that can deal damage, like the Jester. I also like that. And the fact that you can deal damage stems from this crit here, which is 8. That's actually that's above average. Only ever so slightly. But you'll see when we go through his skills that he actually has a very high crit modifier on his skills. And that crit modifier on his skills, included with this decently respectable crit number here, will allow us to activate his crit buff pretty often, which is a buff for plus 40% stress skills. So his Inspiring Tune, which is his stress healing skill, will heal for 40% more after you've crit. So how good is that? That's really good, because the Jester is mainly a stress healer and secondarily a damage dealer. And I really like being able to crit a move and then right after do an Inspiring Tune for 40% more. This is a really nice crit buff. I do dig this crit buff a lot. I make use of it a lot and I'm very happy to get it. But coming in with after his good respectable crit number is a below average damage range of 7 to 13. 7 to 13 is pretty okay for the Jester specifically because he is a bleed champion, and so you will generate a good amount of damage from bleeds as well as this slightly below average damage range. And we'll do calculations later when we get to his skills. Moving over to stun resist, you see that he has one of the lowest stun resists in the game. This is very annoying, especially in the Warrens, where he is a backline character, and the pig with his that pig in front with protection can hit you with his mace ball. I forgot what the move is off the top of my head, but he can hit you with that mace ball, and you can be stunned very easily as a Jester. Very annoying to have in the Warrens, which is a place you kind of do want to bring the Jester because he is a bleed champion, and bleed is very effective in the Warrens against those pigs. This is a very annoying stat to have low for the Jester specifically. His blight resist is pretty high, and that's pretty good. You've got disease resist, very lowest in the game. That's fine, whatever. Move resist, lowest in the game. That's fine, whatever. Especially when you see that the Jester has 3/3 movement. His bleed resist is below average. His debuff resist is slightly above average. That's whatever. And you see that he has trap disarm 90. He is what I consider to be a trap disarmor, but he is getting to the point where it is a little lower and less consistent. It's not too big of a deal, mainly because the two main things about failing a trap disarm, the two main drawbacks of failing a trap disarm is you take some stress and you take HP damage. And the Jester can handle one of those things. He can handle the stress portion of it. He is the best stress healer in the game by a long shot, and so he should be able to control stress just fine. 3-3 movement, as I said before, this is very good because this Jester is able to move from any position to any position. That's very, very flexible. He has the best movement in the game, and he is allowed to therefore help your other characters move back and forth. If in the case of a shuffle or a surprise, he's able to help your characters move back and forth and get into their optimal positions. So let's do a quick recap, even though I jumped here and there with the stats. We've got like pretty respectable-ish bulk, not really, because we have then paired with not green dot resist. So overall, he's, I would say, a very frail character, probably one of the frailer ones in the game. But since you're hiding him in rank 3 most of the time, that's pretty like okay for a rank 3 character. It's not gonna be like he's probably gonna be one of the characters you'll find on Death's Door most often, but I still find it decently hard to lose characters if you have, like, say, a very good healer like the Jester or the Occultist, for example. I'd be much more worried about the Occultist, who I deem to be a frontline character, who has even weaker main defensive stats than the Jester. And then we have a respectable damage range and a respectable damage range for the Jester and a respectable crit. Got a good crit buff for that as well. And we've got whatever in terms of the other stats, because they don't matter as much, except for stun, which is going to be very annoying for you in the Warrens. And just in general, because stun, there's a lot of enemies who reach into rank 3 in the Darkest Dungeons that can stun you, and so that's very annoying. Right, so here we have the Jester skills. This is what I believe to be his optimal layout. Before I talk about his skills, I want to kind of describe to you what the Jester's set does. You'll see as I scroll through these skills really fast that at the bottom of each skill, you'll see a buff self, finale plus 30% damage, or finale plus 75, finale plus crit, finale plus 30 plus crit plus crit. You'll see that all of his other moves in his set buff one move called finale, and that's this move. They either buff him for damage, damage and crit, damage and crit, damage and crit. So they all serve to buff one move called finale, and finale is a single use move that can be used only once per fight. How good is this overall idea? I think this overall idea is actually very, very weak. It's not very notable because we want when we enter a hallway fight, we want to be able to output damage as fast as possible. And this backloaded damage design of the Jester and his finale is very on point in terms of flavor. It's very cool to end the fight with finale, but it's not very good for gameplay because we don't want to be nuking characters later on in the fight, because later on in the fight, the only characters that you should leave alive are the frontline characters, which you are stress healing and healing off of during the stalling phase. So there's no point in nuking positions 1 and 2. In fact, that's actually highly discouraged. I would discourage you from trying to do that actively in hallway fights. In regular hallway fights, that is. You'll see that I still have it equipped as one of his quote-unquote optimal moves, so there must be a reason why, and I'll explain that when we get to finale, looking at finale in depth. But just so I don't have to one by one go through all of these moves and talk about that buff self, I don't think it's very notable. There are fights in the game, so for example, a few boss fights, where finale is actually a valid strategy, and the one I'm thinking of right off the top of my head is actually Darkest Dungeon 4, where you are fighting the last phase of the final boss, and a way to avoid the ultimate move that is going to come down onto your characters and deathblow them, to nuke the boss down from a certain HP threshold. And Finale is very good at doing that because you've been spending most of the earlier phases of that fight using moves that buff it, and then you can nuke the boss with Finale, and then sacrifice the Jester, because he is probably useless after using Finale. But all in all, generally, you should not be aiming to use moves buffing Finale and then use Finale at the end of hallway fights. That is not a good way to play the Jester. Let's go through all of his moves one by one, and let's talk about them, though. We've got Dirk Stab here as his first move, launchable from any position of your team, and can hit the positions 1, 2, and 3 of the opponent's team. This is actually a pretty good move. It gives the Jester a lot of applications in dancing comps as well. He's not a dancer usually, in my mind, because Dirk Stab is slightly outclassed by the other moves on his set. I believe the other moves have a very strong niche and general purpose usage, strong enough that Dirk Stab isn't run. And the reason for that is that Dirk Stab just doesn't do enough damage, really, to run on the Jester. And offers really little actual utility. So we've got 105 base accuracy. That's one of the lowest ones in the game, so it doesn't really hit frequently enough. It's got a crit mod of 9. That's nice. Crit mods of 9 are very powerful, especially when you have a base crit of 8, which means you bring your crit rate up to 17 with using Dirk Stab. And 17 is very good. You crit 1 in 6 times, and of course we would love to activate the Jester's crit bonus. But you'll see later as we go through this that, for example, Slice Off has 12, and that's much better. Bypass Guard is a mechanic that is only found on the Jester and the Shield Breaker, and so it's a very nichely found mechanic. But how much do I value it? I don't value it at all, because you can bypass guard and hit the person who is being guarded in the same turn. But if you're running a full move for it instead of just running stuns to stun the guarder and then use someone else to attack that person who was guarded, I don't think it's worth it to run a full move just because of that. And so we find that Dirk Stab is just overall not very exciting to run when you compare it to other dancers with their forward 1 moves, like the Crusader with Holy Lance, which is a huge nuke, like the Highwayman with Duelist Advance, which is setting up riposte, like the Shieldbreaker, who's using Pierce, a very strong move with protection piercing as well, or Rampart, stun someone. And so Dirk Stab just ends up not being run, and therefore Jester is not generally a dancer to me. His next move is Harvest. Harvest is a move that can be launched from positions 2 and 3 from your team, and will AoE hit positions 2 and 3 on the enemy's team. It's got a base accuracy of 110, a damage mod of -50, which is reducing its damage even further. The Jester already has low damage, so it does reduce it further. It's not that big of a deal, since this move is a bleed-oriented move at 4x3 bleed. Actually a respectable bleed. It's a moderate bleed. But it does suffer from the same problem as all other AoEs in the game, which is you're not focusing down enemies, and focusing down enemies is too important to consider running Harvest over something like Slice Off, which has a better damage mod, a better crit rate, a better bleed, and obviously being able to hit rank 3 is very good for Harvest, but Slice Off can do the exact same, and it can focus down rank 3, and that's very, very important. You can also see that Harvest has a much lower crit mod than Slice Off at 4%, and obviously Slice Off being at 12. But if you do the math, when you roll this 12% crit chance on 2 characters, like you have an overall percentage to crit at least once of 22% roughly. I believe I did my math right with the binomial distribution here. You should at least crit once between these 2 characters that you're targeting, 22-ish% of the time, versus, of course, Slice Off with 12 mod hitting 1 character. That's 20% of the time. So if you really just want to crit and stress heal with a Jester, you can run a set that's like this. Though this set from the Jester is outputting damage very, very slowly and not as efficiently as if you were to run Slice Off. It's just Slice Off is my personal preference. Finale. So this is where we start talking about his damaging capabilities. The Jester himself has a below average damage mod, and Finale is not a bleed skill, so we have to judge Finale as if, obviously, as the Jester has a low damage range. So right away, you see damage mod of +50 on Finale, and that's really good because damage mod applies additively. So what that means is it gets applied additively first before anything else. So the game treats damage mods and damage buffs very differently. So a damage mod applies directly to your damage range right away. So we go from 7 to 11, and from 13 to 20. So his damage range is 11 to 20, and then buffs get applied to that damage range. So 11 to 20 is the damage range that you are going to be applying damage buffs to. And obviously we have a lot of damage buffs and all the other skills buffing it up. So 11 to 20 is equal to the Abomination in terms of damage mods. And the Abomination is the second highest damage dealer in the game in terms of damage range. So we are working with a very high damage range to start with for Finale. And so that means the skill actually has a lot of potential, especially since you're buffing it so many times. All these Finale buffs, I believe they last for 8 rounds instead of the typical 3. So you can stack 8 rounds of buffs on this before you actually use it. So that's plus 200. These all have like a plus 30-ish damage boost, so plus 240%. Plus 240% on 11 to 20 is so much damage. I'm not even going to do the math. It's somewhere in like the 50s, I believe, right off the top of my head. But you're able to nuke someone for 50, and that's without a crit. And that's without any other trinkets and quirks for damage. So that is a lot of damage. And it does help, again, when we talk about nuking that Darkest Dungeon 4 boss. And that's really cool. I like this skill. I believe it's optimal. And the only reason I run it and consider it optimal is in the case that we enter a hallway fight that's a little longer. Like, for example, there's a size 2 enemy. Or we suddenly spawn in a collector. Or we suddenly spawn in a shambler. Or we suddenly spawn in a shambler. Or if we were to activate a shambler's altar, we can find ourselves in a position where we are shuffled into ranks 1 and 2, with after buffing the Jester for so long, where we do like to drop a Finale on the collector's or the shambler's head, and we like to nuke them, and that is what Finale does, and I think that's very cool for Finale. This is a very, very powerful move, and it moves the Jester back 3, by the way. So he gets back into his little hidey hole in the back lines, where these debuffs on him that we see for using Finale are not as important. These debuffs are battle long, so for the rest of the battle you have negative 25 dodge, minus 3 speed, and plus 100% stress. The Jester, as a character that relies on dodge to survive, taking minus 25 dodge, which is leaving him with 10 dodge overall, is pretty scary. Any moves that can reach the backline or pull you forward to be hit by the frontliners will be very painful to the Jester. And also, in the backline, you get stress casted. The stress casters can reach you, and so taking 100% stress from those stress casters is also not ideal. Minus 3 speed is whatever. It's not too impactful for a Jester who's already gotten off a Finale and done a lot of damage. Good move, though, overall. His next move is Solo. It is a move that is launchable from positions 3 and 4, and AoE hits the entire enemy team. I'm very confused about this AoE hitting the entire enemy's team, because this move actually doesn't do anything to them. It doesn't debuff them, or it doesn't deal damage to them. So I'm not sure why this target thing is in the game, in his tooltip here. I think all you really care about is just it's launchable from 3 and 4, and that's it. It's usable twice for battle, and the idea of Solo, what it's designed to do, is it's designed to be used right before your Finale. And the reason for that is, the reason I say that is because it gives a bigger Finale damage buff than the other moves. The other moves give a plus 30% damage, and Solo gives a plus 75% damage to Finale. It's actually a very big buff, and it's pretty respectable, brings it up to very high numbers very quickly. But it suffers the same problem as a lot of self buffs, in that you don't want your damage to be backloaded in a fight. You want your damage to be usable from the first turn, and so you can nuke the stress casters very easily before they can stress cast you, and you don't want your damage to be backloaded, and dots are a little backloaded damage, so they're not as recommended sometimes. And dots still pass the test, though. They still do get a lot of damage very fast. But Solo buffing and then not buffing yourself this turn and not dealing damage this turn, not being able to deal any chip damage at all, is not very good for hallway fights. And so solo, despite giving such huge buffs, just doesn't make it. It gives plus 30 dodge, huge finale buff, and a huge finale crit buff, and marks the Jester. So, like, not a good move. The general better moves are these three, and finale itself is just sneaking its way on the set just because the other three moves aren't needed. But let's move on to Slice Off, one of his better moves. This is his main damaging move. Slice Off is launchable from positions 2 and 3 and can hit the enemy's positions 2 and 3. Obviously, our highest priority target is in position 3 and 4, in positions 3 and 4. And this move being able to hit position 3 is very, very important. Not only that, it does have a respectable damage mod at negative 33. We do have to remember this is a bleed skill, so it will come with lower damage, but it will make up for that in terms of bleeds. So let's do some math real quick. Minus 33% on his damage range, and then let's add the bleeds to check how much damage this does. So minus 33 on 7 is 5? Is that true? Wait, minus... So it's running more than 2. Yeah, it's 5 to 9. So it does 5 to 9. And then you bleed for 5. So it does 10 to 14. 10 to 14, it's more controlled. You have a larger control. It doesn't have as high of a high point. It obviously doesn't have as low as a low point as 8 to 15.5. It's still good. It's actually a very good move because it does apply that bleed, and so you will do more damage next turn as well, so it'll start racking that damage up, as well as having a very respectable crit mod, so you will sometimes crit and deal more than the average, and by sometimes I mean 20%. He's actually a crit monster, Jester, with Slice Off. 20% to crit a move onto rank 3 is very, very good. So this is probably one of his better skills. It's definitely his best offensive skill in comparison to Harvest and Dirk Stab. So I highly recommend running this. Battle Ballad is his next move. It is a team-wide buff, launchable from positions 3 and 4, and it buffs the entire team by 4 speed, 10 accuracy, and 6 crit. These buffs are very, very insane. Buffing speed for your team, plus 4 speed is very, very powerful. That's one of the biggest... that is actually the biggest speed buff in the game, and it is a very big speed jump because speed is determined by a D8 roll, which means you are canceling out half of the D8 roll of the opponents with one use of this skill. These buffs also last, for some reason, they last for 4 turns instead of 3, as normal buffs do, and so you get a lot of mileage out of using this buff in the late game. 10 accuracy is also a very, very powerful offensive buff. There's a lot of characters in this game that have just slightly below average accuracy, and you want to put 10 extra accuracy on them. Notable characters of this category are, of course, the Hellion, the Houndmaster, the Leper you can buff. He actually has 95, so you'd love to bring up a little higher. Crusader has 105. Bounty Hunter has 105. A lot of very respectable damage dealers have 105. I would appreciate just even one usage of this would buff them for the next 4 rounds for 10 accuracy, and that's very, very cool. I appreciate that accuracy buff a lot. And you also get a 6% crit buff to increase the damage dealing output of the team. This is actually this is actually probably the best offensive buff in the game. It's certainly not permanent like something like the Plague Doctor's buff, but it is a very, very much more impactful buff than the PD's buff. This is a move that I don't recommend you spamming every round because you will never need up to 16 more speed than you currently have, or 40 accuracy or 24 crit than you already have. But I do recommend you sprinkling this in between each, maybe like every other round or maybe once every 3 rounds is a good idea to use a Battle Ballad. Yeah, good move. Battle Ballad plus Slice Off is a very typical combo for the race portion of the fight. And Inspiring Tune is the recovery portion of the fight for the Jester, and it is his stress healing skill, usable in positions 3 and 4. Stress heals for 12. That is one of the highest stress heals in the game. This is only second to the Flagellant. who can heal for, let me check real quick, I believe he heals for 14. Yeah, he heals for 14, but he actually adds 6 stress to himself. So overall, he heals for 8 stress across the party, while the Jester just heals for 12. So this is, I would be willing to call this the best stress heal in terms of in terms of just sheer numbers. But on top of the sheer number of, sheer amount of stress you're healing off of your ally, you also buff that ally for minus 20% stress taken. So you even further decrease the stress that they will be taking for the rest of the fight. This is in the case that you take reinforcement AoE stress as well as taking reinforcements. You can take reinforcements with Inspiring Tune and just heal through the reinforcements as well as the original fight. This is a very, very good skill, very, very powerful. There's a lot of application for this skill. This skill is one of my favorite skills to just spam over and over again. This is the only time I'm going to mention it because this is probably the best character you can do this with. But you can de-afflict a character by bringing their stress all the way down to 0. And Inspiring Tune is so efficient at doing that. So Inspiring Tune is a gold saver in that you can bring an afflicted character into the dungeon with the Jester, stress heal them repeatedly over and over again throughout the battle, and get them down to 0 stress. And just like that, you just saved not only some gold for putting them in stress buildings, but also some time. You can still use them for that week. You don't have to lose a week by putting them into stress building. And stress buildings also have other negative connotations to them. They have negative effects that can happen to you. So you can not risk those negative effects as well. The Jester is very, very powerful when you consider Inspiring Tune as one of his skills to run. And therefore, you should always run Inspiring Tune. And you can see that as we look through all of these moves, they all work at least in position 3, so I believe Jester to be a position 3 character. And he's kind of locked into position 3. So let's go over his camp skills and see how powerful they are. Generally, they have a stress healing component to them, like Turn Back Time, which heals 30 stress and heals an extra 15 stress if that companion is afflicted. So it can heal up to 45 stress, which is very, very powerful for a time cost of 3. It's actually very, very powerful for a time cost of 3 just to heal 30 stress off of one of your characters as well, because when we compare it to the generalist stress healing skill of Encourage, you spend an extra point to get double you spend 50% more points, so you spend 1 point more, to get double the effectiveness in terms of stress healing. So Turn Back Time is actually very powerful when you compare it to Encourage, but Turn Back Time is not very powerful when you compare it to the fact that you have a Jester on the team who already has a stress healing skill that you will be spamming during the stress healing phase of the fight. Very often, I will look at Turn Back Time in my campfire, and I'll think to myself, I don't really need to spend points on this. This is not a buff, and it won't increase the effectiveness of my damage dealers. So I find myself not really using the skill that much. In a pinch, and when it does apply, the afflicted portion of this, when that does apply, this skill becomes very, very powerful. Being able to rip 45 stress off of one of your allies is very good, but ripping 45 stress off of one of your characters is also a part of Inspiring Tune. You can use that 4 times and do that. And the Jester during the stalling phase of the fight isn't doing much anyway, so you'll be casting Inspiring Tune a lot of the time. So this is not very strong. In the early game it is, when Inspiring Tune hasn't scaled up to this number, but it gets weaker and weaker as you get into the late game. And the same can be said for Every Rose Has Its Thorns, which is a similar idea, just a stress heal. So I'm going to skip over Every Rose Has Its Thorns. Very, very powerful in the early game, one of the best skills to click in the early game. Very cheap for such a huge stress heal, but just not applicable when you consider that he already does that with Inspiring Tune. We're going to go on to Tiger's Eye, which is a time cost of 3, and this buffs 1 ally for 10 accuracy and 8 crit. This is a very, very powerful camp skill. It is probably the best plus 10 accuracy camp skill in the game. This is very powerful when you use it for certain bosses, like the Brigand Pounder, where you just need a Hellion that can hit that matchman, or a Shieldbreaker that can just hit that matchman and can get huge numbers off on that matchman. And it can do that, and it has very, very strong applications. And this is a reason why Tiger's Eye is powerful, but that's also a reason why Battle Ballad is powerful. So it does have a slight overlapping properties with Battle Ballad, but the difference, and that's just the same thing as these stress healing skills versus Inspiring Tune, but the difference is, and what makes Tiger's Eye so powerful, is that this is going to be something that benefits you in the race part of the fight. And in the race part of the fight, Jester might not want to cast Battle Ballad. He might want to cast Slice Off instead to finish someone off. And so Tiger's Eye freeing up his ability to not cast Ballad, not like freeing up his flexibility, is very, very powerful for that reason. And it also does give a huge crit buff to said Hellion or Shield Breaker or other damage dealer. So this skill is very, very powerful and still is used in late game a lot. For me, Mockery is his last skill. It has a time cost of 2, and all companions. So the Jester chooses one companion, and that companion takes 20 stress damage, and the other companions will stress heal for 20, and that excludes the Jester. So overall, what you're doing is you're moving stress around, and so the ultimate result is that you are only stress healing for 20. Like, how good is stress healing for 20 for a camp skill that costs 2? Well, it's certainly better than Courage, and that already makes Mockery pretty good in the early game. But and especially it's very good to target someone who can control their own stress, like the Leper or the Abomination. Mocking the Leper and mocking the Abomination are two very, very good things to do with this skill in the early and late game. But again, we just have a stress healer. There's no reason to not just spam Inspiring Tune and get those stress heals anyway. And so this ends up being not very used. So we have 3 kind of mediocre / outclassed camp skills and 1 very, very powerful camp skill. So that's his camp skills. Let's move on to talk about his trinket. Okay, and these are the Jester's trinkets. Of special note, actually, this time as well, is that the uncommon is actually very, very good. The uncommon is called Critical Dice for the Jester. It gives him +7 crit. +7 crit is a very, very powerful amount to buff in terms of for trinkets, because the highest crit buff in the game in terms of trinkets is actually +8. So being just 1 under plus the highest in the game at +7 is very, very good for an uncommon, which you can just grab in the early game. Not to mention, Jester's crit buff is something we really want to be activating a lot. So a special mention, because not only are we increasing the Jester's damage output abilities, but we are also increasing Jester's stress healing capabilities. And that's a very, very good thing, because the Jester is both of those things together. Bright Tambourine is his rare, and let me just say it right now, this rare is off the charts in terms of power. It does so much stuff. These numbers are so large. The Jester's rare trinket, Bright Tambourine here, gives his stress healing skills +25% extra stress heal. So that's both his camp skills and his actual skills. So you will get a lot of value out of this if you use his camp skills to stress heal as well. And it also gives the Jester -25% stress taken. So as a backline character, what you really get hit with a lot is some annoying stuff, like maybe some diseases and stuff, and also stress skills. And having the Jester mitigate a quarter of the incoming stress to himself is so powerful. This trinket is the numbers on this trinket is just so insane. Just comparing this to a very rare trinket, a generalist trinket that is very rare, called the Book of Sanity. The Book of Sanity gives an unconditional -20% stress taken, and this gives -25% stress as a rare trinket. Granted, it does come with a condition of needing to have your torch above 75, but you almost always play with your torch above 75 anyway. And if you're running Bright Tambourine, you're certainly going to be keeping it above 75 just to get this huge boon that comes with this trinket. This trinket is definitely on the power level of very rare. And I do not know why the developers have put this trinket in the game at just a rare level. Honestly, I would do very dangerous missions just to grab this trinket for the Jester, and it'd be very worth it, because a Jester with Bright Tambourine in the late game will be ripping stress off of your characters like there's no tomorrow. You should never be afflicted in the late game with a Jester, and you should certainly never, never be afflicted in late game with a Jester that's holding Bright Tambourine. And let's move on to his very rare trinket, Dark Tambourine, which is the exact opposite. You know how much praise I just gave the Bright Tambourine? It's the exact opposite for Dark Tambourine, and let's go through why. Death Blow Resist +12. Death Blow Resist +12. I like Death Blow Resist, obviously. If you're going to give me some Death Blow Resist, I would love that. But Death Blow Resist is a very weak stat to buff, because you don't want to be on Death's Door. You don't want to be on Death's Door at all. So it's a stat that you're going to actively not be using, and you're going to use a trinket for that, and that's not really that exciting. It's okay. I'll take it. But let's go through the next tags that are a part of the Bright Tambourine, which is -25% stress if the torch is below 26. So this is the exact buff as Bright Tambourine, you can see here, 25, but this time your torch has to be below 26. And just, let's switch over to the light meter description here. When your torch is below 26, when you're in dark, your characters, all of them, take extra stress. And on Radiant and Darkest, that's 30% extra. On Stygian and Blood Moon, it's 35% extra. So let's assume you're playing on Stygian and Blood Moon, right? So that means you're like, to activate the Dark Tambourine, you have to be taking 35 extra stress. So 35 extra stress is a lot greater than minus 25. So you're net taking 10 extra stress when you activate the Dark Tambourine's stress reduction component. You're still taking more stress. To activate this trinkets, to activate that trinket, that portion of this trinket, you're actually taking 10% more stress. So this reads 10% more stress. Certainly you're in the dark and you will be getting more loot, but dark runs are not needed. You don't need to have that much loot for that much risk. Though there is a nice synergistic component to that, in that you take more stress, but you do get Virtue Chance. And Virtue Chance plus 10 if the torch is below 26. Virtue Chance is at base 25%, and buffing that by 10% doesn't really excite me, because then you're at 35%, which is still not very likely. You shouldn't be praying for a virtue. Just stay away from being afflicted and doing that virtue roll, and you can do that very easily by just having a Jester at full light doing his inspiring tune. Not very good trinket. You will be actively trying to stay away from these conditions. So Bright Tambourine, I would say is a staple for him in the late game. What's his other trinket? His other trinket is up to you. It's kind of whatever you want to run. I find Jesters also to not really, since they don't really have to buff their damage in any way because they're more a bleed-oriented champion. You can go with defensive trinkets, like for example, you can try Fortifying Garlic to make sure he doesn't take too much damage. Since he is in the 3rd rank, he wouldn't really need that. Dots don't really typically reach the 3rd rank unless you're going to the Wield, where the fungal artillery will try and blight you. But you can consider a Fortifying Garlic. It's not a bad idea. The other thing you can consider is, actually, I honestly, if you ran Bright Tambourine plus critical dice in the end game, that's fine too. If you found a better crit trinket to put on the Jester, that's okay too. If it's better than 7, that's fine. Just turn him into a crazy stress healer and damage dealer with crit dice instead, and that's a good idea. The Ancestors map finds its way onto my Jesters a lot, because he just kind of has nothing else to really trinket for, so why not give him a powerful scouting chance trinket? And yeah, so Bright Tambourine plus something is the usual trinket layout for a Jester in late game. Oh, a special note actually is that I think the Jester is the only character I would be very, very comfortable running the Overture box on, which is one of the Madman's trinkets. It gives you plus 15% HP, I believe, plus some dodge and minus some accuracy. Those are all fine things to have on the Jester. Like, you don't really care about his offensive accuracy. It's already pretty good when slice off, so it's not that big of a deal. And if it really does worry you that much, you can ballad and then slice off. But -2 accuracy is like barely anything, and I would definitely trade that off for some extra bulk on the Jester, which is one of the frailer characters in the game. So yeah, I would consider that a decent trinket. Bright Tambourine plus Overture Box is definitely something I would be running a lot in the late game for a Jester. It's just I haven't seen Overture Box in a lot of my recent files, so I'm a little hazy on how on the Overture Box. Okay, and we're here to talk about the Jester's team comps. So the Jester is kind of hard locked into position 3 because of his best skills being usable from position 3, and so we have to try and fit other characters around him. Obviously, you want to bring a healer, so you want to either consider the Vestal or the Occultist. We can consider a Vestal right now. This gives you the standard backline of Jester plus Vestal, which is a very strong core. Mainly because the Vestal will take care of the heal, the Jester will take care of the stress portion of your characters. The problem with this backline is that it doesn't actually put out a lot of damage, and it's not going to be strong enough. So you need some damage dealers in front, and you've already got a stunner in the Vestal, so we need stunners plus damage dealers. You're going to need something compact, kind of like the Bounty Hunter, and then you'll start to see that you are missing rank 4 damage, and so you want rank 4 damage, so that'll prompt you to either put on a Hellion or a... where is she? Shieldbreaker, right. And these are good teams. Hellion, Shieldbreaker is a good idea. Like, these are both very strong characters, and these are good teams. I've probably built this by accident in other videos. Also of note, you can stick the this guy in 1, and then have the Highwayman in 2. And so you've got a Highwayman with Riposte, and the Jester is buffing up his crit the entire time, and he's a crit machine as well with Duelist Advance and Riposte, so that'll be very effective in killing enemies. Very, very strong. Jester plus Highwayman is actually a very strong duo as well, just because Battle Ballad gives the Highwayman everything that he needs and wants. It gives the speed that makes the Highwayman above average speed. It gives him accuracy, which makes his riposte when he's counterattacking very, very good. Very, very consistent at hitting, and it gives him crit, which means he can crit more often with his riposte, and he can actually help in stress healing the team that way as well. But this is not a Highwayman review, so let me stop talking about the Highwayman. Other teams you can put the Jester. Other team members you can put with the Jester are, let's try an Occultist frontline this time. The Occultist. Let's put him over here. So you have a stunner and you have a healer. So let's start to look for damage dealers in these two positions. So damage dealers in these positions would be, we could put a Houndmaster in the back. We can actually put him in front so he has access to a stun. He doesn't really need his stress healing because the Jester will take over the stress healing. And now we need a character in the back. We would like to have an off healer, but we do have a self healer in the Houndmaster, so you can consider the Arbalist. But we can try something else too. We can actually try just a Plague Doctor. And so we have actually a lot of control with stuns with this comp. We've got dots all over. We've got 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dot. And that's pretty strong. We do have Plague Doctor is also a good off healer. So this is a strong comp. It's a little frail. It's a little on the frailer side. But you do have dodge tanking with the Houndmaster in 2, where you can cover the Occultist and you can just focus on stress healing and healing the Houndmaster. And that's a decent comp. This is a little frailer. This is probably not for the faint of heart. But yeah, so these are the two comps, I guess. And there are obviously many more you can run with the Jester. The Jester is actually very, very flexible, as long as you keep in mind that he's he's kind of locked into position 3, which is kind of funny because I said flexible and locked into position 3 in the same sentence. But yeah, he can be really used with anybody, as long as, honestly, find the most stressed person on your roster, be they afflicted or not. So okay, for example, I have 2 afflicted characters on this team. I want to de-afflict them, so let's put, we should put a PD on the team, because I want to use the Jester to de-afflict the PD, and then you can build from there. Just make sure to keep stuns, damage, and healing in mind. Alright, so let's move on to the conclusion. What is my overall rating of the Jester? The Jester is pretty good. I like him a lot. He's one of my favorite characters. He saves a lot of money, but money isn't combat value. But does he have a lot of combat value? He does. He does have a lot of combat value between his buffs and his slice off, and finale is like alright for DD4. Actually, I say alright, but it's actually very good for DD4. So he does have applications in the darkest dungeons that are very powerful. So what do I rank him? I actually had a lot of trouble ranking him either lower A tier or upper B tier. I ended up placing him in upper B tier, mainly because although stress healing is very nice, it can be substituted with stress buildings in the Hamlet, and it can be substituted because there are other stress healers in the game. Jester is definitely the best stress healer in the game, but stress healing can be done by both by all of the following: Houndmaster, Crusader, and Flagellant, and they all manage stress pretty well. So the Jester's job is not as niche as you would think. He is the best at it, but he is not the only one for it. You can also just, if you're effective enough at killing the backliners, you probably won't need a stress heal. So if you run an offensively oriented party, you can defeat the stress casters before they can stress cast you, and that is a a much more recommended way to control stress, and therefore that makes the Jester B tier, although he is higher B tier. And that wraps up the Jester review. Thank you for watching.